One of the things that makes RED unique is its after-capture approach to something called debayering. We're going to go over what a Bayer filter actually does and why debayering can take so much effort from your workstation. The light-sensitive surface of a camera is made up of millions of tiny light-sensitive components called photosites. The light-sensitive part of the camera chip contains a grid of these tiny things. When light strikes a photosite, it generates a signal based on the light that strikes it, and this then corresponds to a pixel on the recorded image. The light that strikes a photosite is converted to a numeric value within the image or footage file. This happens millions of times per second, and the resulting flood of data is then encoded by the camera into a footage file or stored as a RAW file depending on the camera. Now, if we're talking about a monochrome image, that's pretty much it. In a black and white image, all the R, G and B values of any individual pixel will be the same. Remember how the image goes black and white when all three waves in the parade line up perfectly. But with colour, things get more complicated. Colour sensors work differently. On a monochrome sensor, each photosite will absorb all colours of light. In a colour sensor, each photosite can only absorb a single colour of light. This is down to a colour filter array, a set of coloured filters that allow only red, green or blue light to filter through and strike any individual photosite. There are multiple patterns of colour filter array, and the most popular and widespread is the Bayer pattern, hence the term Bayer pattern filter. The Bayer pattern filter overlays coloured filters over the photosites in the camera's sensor in a pattern of two alternating rows. One row alternates between green and blue filters, whilst the other alternates between red and green filters. This means that there are twice as many green photosites compared to either red or blue. And this is because the human eye is actually more sensitive to green light compared to red or blue light. In fact, green light actually contributes about twice as much to perceived brightness as either of the other two colours. This has the pleasant effect of producing an image with more perceived detail and less perceived noise compared to all three colours being given equal focus. So at this point we have an incomplete image. It looks too green and we don't actually have any complete colour information for any pixel yet. Every single pixel is either red, green or blue. What needs to happen now is that we need to somehow work out the true colour values for each pixel. This is where demosaicing comes into play, and in particular we're talking about debayering, as we used a Bayer pattern filter in our red camera to begin with. The camera uses a demosaicing algorithm to work out a pixel's full colour value, and this can vary depending on a number of things. We're not going into the nitty-gritty of how a demosaicing algorithm actually arrives at its conclusion, because that knowledge won't help us be better colourists. But the algorithm will take stock of a number of factors and fill in the full colour values of pixels based on the colours of surrounding pixels, perceived edges in the image, and other factors depending on that camera. Now, these algorithms aren't perfect. In fact, the commonly seen moire pattern is an artifact of demosaicing going wrong and making mistakes in areas of high-density, fine detail. So finally onto where this affects us in the grade in real terms. Red RAW files are recorded with this Bayer pattern filter and are not debayered at the point of capture. Red files are debayered to the highest quality afterwards during post. This means that our workstation is applying the full debayering algorithm as we work with the red RAW files in Resolve. This is why the premium quality decode slows us down. We are carrying out this full quality debayering operation on our hardware, and for 8K files, well, that's a lot of work. The practical takeaways from this don't seem to be too numerous at first, but we simply need to know that the premium quality decode gives us the best final image quality. However, a lot of what we've covered actually has practical applications during the grade. We'll go further into how understanding colour science can help us when grading later, but it's worth remembering what we've covered here, particularly about the green-red-blue balance inherent in the Bayer pattern filter. This has been a fairly in-depth look at the Bayer pattern filter. Once you're ready, click on through to the next lecture. Okay, we've gone through a basic decode on RED. We're now going to take a look at how we might approach a manual decode using the settings available within Resolve. Now, we've already got a good decode going for our footage from Scary Crows. However, if you want to practice finessing the debayering and the decode of your footage, these are the controls that you would use. I'm going to assume you're familiar with the basics from the lecture at the start of the previous practical project. We'll recap color space and gamma to begin with. First, and this is important, there are no absolute correct settings here. There are some settings which are more readily associated with certain workflows and camera models, but in the end it's all a matter of preference. So, on to colour space. We'll go over a few different choices here. The first is Red Wide Gamut RGB. This is the colour space for Red's new IPP2 pipeline. It's intended to be the ideal starting point for all Red workflows. This colour space is designed to record all possible colours a Red camera can perceive with minimum amounts of clipping. In most cases, it's best to set our colour space to this option. We used a different option earlier because we were using source from a much older model of Red. Next, Rec 709. This is the standard colour gamut for SDR video. This can be useful, but it's not necessary to use this option when grading for broadcast. This can be used in conjunction with the Rec 709 gamma curve for a quick and very dirty decode. The next is sRGB. This is the standard colour space for computer displays. It can be used for projects delivered to web, but it's not essential to grade web projects using it. And the next is Red Color 3. This used to be our go-to option when decoding Red before wide gamut came along. It's a heavily optimized version of the Red colour space with a particular focus on skin tones. And next, we have Red Color 4. This is a further optimized version of Red Color 3 and it's particularly good for underwater footage. And finally, we have Dragon Color and Dragon Color 2. Now, these are unsurprisingly meant for Dragon sensor models of Red, but they can be used with other Red models as well. Now, the truth is that we mostly use Red Wide Gamut RGB these days, unless you have particular issues with something like underwater footage, or a very specific delivery in mind and want to monitor all the way through in a particular colour space. Wide gamut is usually the way to go. Now that we've covered colour space, we're going to go on to gamma curves. These dictate the transfer function used to decode the linear light information recorded by the Red sensor into a starting point for our grade. Now, there are good and bad choices here, but again, it's largely down to preference. We'll cover the more relevant choices here. The first is Red Gamma 4. Now, this one is the go-to for the minimum effort grade. That's not necessarily bad. This curve gives a decent look right out of camera that just needs a few tweaks. Good for things with a fast turnaround, and this curve works for every model of Red camera. The next is Linear. This actually applies no transfer function whatsoever and leaves the data captured by the camera in its linear distribution. I can't really think of an application for this. Linear information isn't great to work with, and that's actually why we've developed transfer functions with cameras to begin with, to make the image make sense when we see it. I don't recommend using Linear. The next is Rec 709. This is the standard curve for Rec 709 displays. Now I know what you're thinking, it sounds like a great shortcut, but I've only had bad experiences working with this curve. It usually requires a lot of work with the other decode tools to make it viable. For better out-of-camera looks, I recommend you go with Red Gamma 4. And next is Log3 G10. This is one of the partner curves for the Red Wide Gamut colour space and forms part of the new IPP2 pipeline. With any newer model of Red, the idea is to combine this curve with the Wide Gamut colour space, and that gives you your ideal starting point for all SDR projects shot on Red. This curve works with all models of Red camera. And then we have Log3 G12. Now, this is basically a lot like Log3 G10, but instead of SDR, it's intended for HDR work. And finally, Red Log. This used to be the general favourite for detailed grading with Red cameras. Then Log3 G10 stole its thunder. If you have a much older model of Red, then this, along with Red Color 3 or 4, is a great starting point for an in-depth grade. Now, as we've heard a few times by now, Red has gotten a lot easier to use since the induction of IPP2. If we stick with the Wide Gamut and Log3 G10 combo, we're going to be fine in most cases. So this was a fairly detailed overview of the first set of Red decoding tools. We're going to cover some more in the next lecture, so click on through once you're ready. Right, more decode tools for Red. This time we're going to cover the decoder and metadata settings over this in the next lecture. Now, we haven't covered these at all yet, so there'll be quite a bit to take in. Just put some time aside to experiment so you can get a feel for these. Whilst we're going to cover these tools, I must tell you that in most cases I'm fine just setting my colour space and gamma curve and then proceeding to the grade. This is not something you should expect to do for every single Red job that comes your way. The only tool I commonly use in this section is the colour temperature tool, which will be covered in the next lecture. It is important to note all of these tools apply their operations before any other tool in Resolve, so in essence we're defining our starting image with these, the image that lies at the start of our node tree in the green dot on the left hand side, our RGB input essentially. So firstly, denoise. This applies noise reduction to our whole image and cannot be targeted to any particular region. There are 7 settings, and this, as always, is a trade-off between killing the noise and smoothing over important details. I tend not to use this in a project-wide decode because every shot is different. If this is necessary, I usually prefer to use the spatial and temporal noise reduction tools within Resolve. But if a shot is being a problem, I can use this setting with a shot-specific decode to address just the problematic shots. And our next one is the OLPF compensation. Now, we've gone over what moire is. It's basically an error in the demosaicing of a camera that incorrectly infers colours in regions of dense, fine detail. The OLPF compensation tool is designed to combat colour moire. If you're getting moire patterns in your red footage, then you should tinker with this setting to reduce the visibility of those errors. By default, this is off, and you should keep it that way unless you have cause to use it. Image detail. This is one of the more important ones. Unless you already have a red rocket card, and who knows, maybe someone in Hollywood is watching this, in which case please recommend me to your line manager, you can choose the level of detail extracted by the debayering algorithm. This should be set to medium or high in most cases. There's a case for setting it to low if we're having significant performance issues, but we don't typically use a $50,000 camera kit and throw away the info that it records. In any case, we're going to want to make sure that we have it on high when we render out. Now for the next set, I'm going to go into the colour panel. So, the FLUT. Now this one's a little different. The FLUT lets us alter the ISO of the footage we have, and we can bring it down or boost it, and depending on the master settings of our decode, we may well have a reason to tinker with this one. The FLUT is different in that it actually alters the exposure of the image data right at the start of the pipeline in Resolve. That means we can use it to recover highlight detail which has been blown out by our initial decode. Under any other circumstances, the details that will be clipped out like this would not be recoverable, but with FLUT, we make that adjustment before anything else, so we can tone our highlights down if we're losing bright detail during our decode. However, if that detail gets completely nuked at the point of capture, it will still be gone, but if it's right at the edge of being blown out, we can probably recover it. And if I just drag the FLUT to the right, things get brighter, and you'll notice that we don't actually clip detail here, we compress it at the top, so it's totally non-destructive. That can be brought down during the grade, and I can bring it down to make it darker as well. So 1 is our default, and our default's a little dim and dull. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to bring that up to about there, and that's now a better starting point for this grade using the FLUT control. And our next is the contrast. Now, as you might expect, this stretches the contrast of our image out around a central point. Anything above 50% is going to get brighter, anything below is going to get darker. This setting, like many of the others in the decode settings, will not actually clip information, but instead compress it. I can drag it up, increase, and I can flatten it down as well. Don't really use this one very much, but it's nice to know it's there. And the next is saturation. You already know what this does. It's the exact same setting as the global saturation in Resolve. Using this, we can boost our colours a bit if we're going for a quickie red gamma 4 decode if it needs a bit of a kick, but I typically leave it alone. Right, this has been good so far, but we won't just data dump everything into one continuous video. Play around with these settings on the red footage from the previous project before moving on, and then click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. We're in the final stretch now, just this and one more lecture to go, and then we're finished with all the red specific stuff. We'll pick up where we left off, and we left off with the tint function. So this is a colour correction setting that adjusts green or magenta within our image. It's most useful when dealing with odd green casts you might get with fluorescent lights or sodium bulbs. This setting adjusts the linear data before it's fed into the Resolve pipeline. This makes it more accurate than fixing this kind of cast than a push to the midtones with the primary wheels. And next is the DRX. Now, this is another setting which, like FLUT, can help us recover highlight detail if it's been blown out by the initial decode. In fact, that's the primary purpose of DRX. It's meant to recover highlights whilst taking colour temperature into account. If you need to recover highlight detail, this should be your first choice when fine-tuning your decode. The next is shadows. This setting adjusts the low range of the FLUT setting. You can make it so FLUT has a different effect over the low range of your image, and if I bring this up, and then play around with FLUT, you'll see that it interacts with the lower values in a different manner. bit counterintuitive, but has its uses. That's a bit much. There we go. Brightness, and there's no surprise here, this adjusts the brightness of your image. If you push it too far, the info is going to compress rather than clip, so nothing will be lost. And then we have ISO. This allows us to change the ISO of the image after the point of capture. Watch out for noise if you boost it too high. The ISO will keep the black point, which is the very bottom of the waveform, remember, still and stretch out everything above it. This differs from the highlight primary wheel, which does have a very small effect even on the darkest values in an image. Any highlight detail that's pushed to the top of the waveform will be compressed and not clipped. And exposure. This changes the brightness of the image in a way that is relative to f-stop. The big thing to watch out for here is that if you push highlights too far with this one, they will clip and the info will be lost and not recoverable after this adjustment, so you need to watch out. And finally, we have color temperature. I use this one quite a lot, as red decodes come out too warm by default when you're working manually, and this is because they default to 6500 Kelvin. This setting will change the warmth of the image and try to keep the highlights neutral. This, like the tint option, works on the linear info before it reaches the rest of the resolve pipeline, which makes it a more accurate way of dealing with general color temperature issues than the primary wheels. Higher values warm up and correct for a blue cast, and lower values cool down and correct for a warm cast, and if we bring this down here, we'll begin to get a much better, more neutral balance. Now everything we've got here has been made entirely with the red decode tools, not with anything we have in the color panel, really, none of the grading tools. So what we can then do is, if we're really, really rushed, we can go through and we can say, right, okay, it's not ideal, but this is a look based on the red decode. It's not fantastic, but it's deliverable. It certainly works. And if we have a really, really tight turnaround, let's say someone's shot a documentary film on red for whatever weird reason they've done that, then you can use the red decode options here to make the whole thing decode very, very quickly. If you're in a real rush, you don't have to go through everything with a fine-tooth comb. It's always more fun to do that, and it always produces a better result to set up a proper log decode and go at it. But now you know how to do a decode with the manual tools in red. That's quite a lot of information to take in over the last 3 lectures. Like I said before, this isn't something you need to do with every red job, but if you receive some particularly challenging red material, then this is where you would go to try and give yourself the best possible starting point. Have a play around with all these settings, and then, you guessed it, click on through to the next lecture. Now, before we launch into this one, it's not going to have a huge impact on how we work in the grade. In fact, it just affects our workstation performance. It doesn't have much impact on the creative aspects of the grade beyond that. Though it's a helpful bit of knowledge to have, and plenty of clients don't know about the red compression ratio. Red footage can be captured with a number of different data rates, which are all denoted by compression ratios. These ratios run from 20:1 all the way to 3:1, with lower ratios denoting better quality of image and also a larger file size. Now, when I first worked with red, I had a problem. I had some shots that just ran super slowly on my workstation at the time, whilst others were absolutely fine. I had no idea why until later. These clips had different compression ratios, and the larger files were the ones playing back more slowly during the grade. In fact, red footage is encoded with a variable data rate codec. This means that an image with more complex color information will actually be larger than an image with less varied info going in. A firework display in full tilt will produce a larger file compared to an identical duration of a pure black night sky, or in this case a seaside. Anyway, back to the subject of compression ratio. Certain clients may want to record with lower compression ratios for shorter form projects like ads meant for television. Those productions don't typically produce the same volume of content as a feature film, and they can afford to use a very high-end ratio like 5:1. Other productions, such as short films, serial-length projects and features, will have to compromise in order to manage their file storage. Just be sure to talk to your client and find out what ratio they are using. If they've been foolish and recorded in a 3:1 compression ratio, then the footage is only going to make an almighty demand on your file storage read and write speeds. It may well not play back in real time at all. Now, the reason I'm including all of this in this course is because I've had clients come to me for advice on this. They've wanted to know what ratio they should use and why, and just in case that happens to you, I want you to know this as well. The high-end ratio is 5:1. This is considered by most to be the sweet spot for file size and image quality. Now, that's not to say that 5:1 is a compromise. In fact, the CEO of Red himself has come out and said that the 3:1 ratio is essentially a placebo. There's almost no perceptible gain between 5:1 and 3:1, and the file size of 3:1 is frankly ridiculous. There's rarely a reason to shoot 3:1 ratio. If your client is shooting a short ad or a corporate piece, then a compression ratio of 5:1 is justifiable, and will give you a final image of excellent quality. If your client is shooting a longer form project, then you have to take into account the amount of storage that is going to be involved. If a client has proudly amassed 100 terabytes of material, then practically speaking, how are you going to transfer that to anyone? Is anyone outside of a high-end facility likely to have access to high-speed storage of that volume? Not really. So choosing a higher ratio is the way to go here. The Red default of 8:1 is good. Ideally, we stick to 8:1 at the lowest and only go lower if there's a genuine cause to do that. We can also choose 7:1 if we're working on a shorter project like a short film, but we always take our storage into account here, and that also means the task of sending the footage to the next person in the pipeline, say for example, the colorist. Now, this has been a decent bit of coverage on the subject of a compression ratio. Like I said before, it tends not to have a massive impact on the grade, and most Red users are savvy enough to know that 3:1 is not a wise choice. We're at the end of our Red module now. Once the next lecture is ready and available, go ahead and click on through.